community make a concerted effort towards rectifying ongoing human rights situations. In particular, we encourage the concerned states themselves to take positive steps towards improving their human rights situation. The international community must also come together in addressing the human rights situation in the DPRK, including the issue of abduction. There has been no sign of improvement in the dire human rights situation pointed out in the COI report 3 years ago. Also, in violation of successive UN Security Council's resolution, the DPRK has carried out repeated provocative actions, including 2 test launches of international ballistic missiles in July, the firing of ballistic missiles through Japan's airspace in August and September, and its 6th and the largest nuclear test in date in September. Japan resolutely condemns in the strongest terms North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles development at the cost of its own people's welfare. We once again express our deep concern at North Korea's continued refusal to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the DPRK and the OHCHR Seoul office. We again request the DPRK to take the following actions. First, to take sincerely to the repeated expressions of the concern from the international community, take a hard look at its severe human rights situation, including its abduction, and take concrete steps towards cooperation with the international community. And second, to cooperate actively with the relevant UN human rights mechanisms. With the Human Rights Council resolution adopted in March, it was decided to strengthen OHCHR's human resources in order to pursue accountability. Japan requests OHCHR to take swift measures to address this issue. Finally, Japan expresses its concern that apart from the situation in the DPRK, we continue to witness suppressions of and restrictions on basic human rights in the region. The Human Rights Council must continue to promote initiatives to make sure that the value of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are universally ensured and enjoyed. The onus is also on the international community to continue making sincere efforts to ensure that these values are upheld. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. Next is the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United States remains deeply concerned about the human rights situations in Syria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Sudan, Myanmar, and South Sudan, which we will address elsewhere in this session. We remain deeply troubled by ongoing harassment of civil society and media in Russia, as well as by the growing number of political prisoners and the increasing pressure on political opposition as 2018 elections approach. We again call on Russia to investigate and hold accountable those responsible for reported detentions, torture, and extrajudicial killings of gay men in Chechnya. We remain deeply concerned by the arbitrary detentions, excessive sentencing, abuse, torture, and harsh prison conditions that Iran imposes on human rights defenders, minorities, and other prisoners of conscience. We deplore the death sentences imposed on prisoners of conscience for exercising their fundamental freedoms and the execution of juvenile offenders. We condemn widespread and gross human rights violations and abuses in the DPRK, including summary executions, enslavement, torture, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearances. We remain troubled by reports that lawyers and activists in China are being arbitrarily detained, tortured, and forced to confess to political charges on state media, and that in many cases, authorities have retaliated against their families. Additionally, we are concerned about conditions akin to martial law that have been imposed in Xinjiang and Tibetan areas. We are concerned by the decision of the Hong Kong authorities to seek tougher sentences for activists after they've served their original sentences. We condemn the Maduro regime's repressive actions to violate human rights, including by suppressing dissent and peaceful protests in Venezuela. We call on it to dissolve the illegitimate Constituent Assembly and restore Venezuela's democratic institutions, hold free, fair, and credible elections as soon as possible, and provide humanitarian assistance for the Venezuelan people. We urge Cuba to release political prisoners and cease the harassment of civil society groups. We remain concerned by the violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Belarus, including elections that are not free and fair, and severe limits to the freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly. Finally, we are troubled by Turkey's severe crackdown on dissenting voices, independent media, and human rights defenders during the protracted state of emergency. Thank you.
I thank you. Next is Slovenia.
Mr. Vice President, we remain a strong supporter of HRC responsiveness to address the human rights situation